This episode is brought to you by San Pellegrino Ciao, a new kind of flavored sparkling water. The kind made with real fruit juice, a pinch of Sicilian salt, and the sparkle of the Italian sun. With no added sugar and just 10 or less calories per can, enjoy. With love, from Italy. By San Pellegrino Ciao now.
Put us in a box. Go ahead. That just gives us something to break out of. Because the next generation 2025 GMC Terrain Elevation is raising the standard of what comes standard. As far as expectations go, why meet them when you can shatter them? What we choose to challenge, we challenge completely. We are professional grade. Visit gmc.com to learn more.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Donald Trump was able to kill off Canada's digital services tax without much of an effort or pushback from Mark Carney's Liberal government in Ottawa. Will supply management be next? And what about Canada's trade future? Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This week, we want to take a deep dive into trade. Canada's prosperity, as well as our future in some ways, is at stake. The Americans are moving away from their negotiated trade deal with us. We've trying to get tariffs off of that, and there are trade irritants like the digital services tax, which will soon be gone, and of course, supply management. Martha Hall Findlay is a former Liberal MP from Toronto. She's been in Western Canada for many years, first as president and CEO of the Canada West Foundation, now as president and chair of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. And trust me when I tell you, she's got some strong opinions on supply management and why she believes it needs to go for the good of Canada, never mind what it means for our trade negotiations. We caught up with each other at her office in downtown Calgary on the margins of the Stampede. Here's our conversation. So, Martha, how do you view things right now? Is Canada in a trade war? Are we at a hinge moment, as Prime Minister Carney likes to say? That's one of his favorite phrases. Are we just dealing with a transformational president, for good or for bad, who is out to adjust the global trading system?
I think it might be a bit of all three. There's no question that we have a moment in time right now for Canada. It's interesting. I mean, I struggle with saying thanks to Donald Trump in the same sentence, but there's no question what's happened south of the border has really forced an awful lot of Canadians and therefore Canadian politicians, but forced an awful lot of Canadians to have a much better, maybe more realistic look at our own economic situation. So we have two big problems. One is, we are significantly dependent on the United States, and we have not diversified enough to expand those opportunities and not to take away from the United States as a market, because geography will dictate that will always be a huge market for us. But we have really not taken advantage of the opportunities in the Indo-Pacific, for example, or in other parts of the world, partly because the United States has been so easy for us. But Donald Trump has clearly made an awful lot of people realize maybe that reliance on the United States needs to be looked at carefully and force us to look at other opportunities elsewhere. In addition, not to move away too much from the States. But the other thing is a realization that our own economic house needs some real work. Our productivity numbers are terrible. Our competitiveness compared to most of the countries that we compare ourselves to is down. Investment has been challenged for a long time. I would say not just the last 10 years. I would say we've struggled the last 25 years. For a variety of reasons. So this isn't just it's not a partisan comment. I think we just have had some real challenges in Canada for 25 years. Is this a hinge moment, as the Prime Minister likes to call it? there's no doubt in my mind this is a moment for Canada, right? Whether it's how do we do better in terms of our relationship with the United States? How do we avoid tariffs? How do we enhance that kind of economic engagement? Whether that's with Trump or a successor to Trump, or what happens after the midterms, whether he becomes less powerful. The fundamental is we still need to work very closely with the United States, and we've benefited from that open trade. We should work to continue to do that. But we also have an awful lot of work in Canada to get our house in order, and this is a moment in time for us. We've had clearly challenges in building infrastructure. We are a trade-dependent nation. We are therefore dependent on trade infrastructure, and we have not invested, whether it be ports, whether it be additional rail, whether it be, yes, even more highways, whether it's pipelines. Absolutely, we have not done a very good job in the last quarter century of building the infrastructure that a trade-dependent country depends on. And so is this a moment in time for Canada because we've been forced to recognize our economic challenges? Absolutely. Are we in a position to take advantage and finally work at getting things right? I sure hope so, but we're in early days so far. The words are sounding good, the language is good, but as we've seen too many times, words don't always get followed up with action. And so here's, really hoping that we'll see action finally, to really get this country back onto the road of the prosperity that we really ought to be able to see.
You mentioned in that answer about diversifying trade. I looked at some stats from a while back, and in the 1890s, when Canada was very much a part of a very big and burgeoning British Empire, we sent about 61% of our exports to either the UK or countries of the empire. And we were also reliant on them for defense. Now we're reliant on the United States for defense, and we send more than 75% of our exports to the United States. So did we just trade one empire for the other that we're reliant upon?
Oh, goodness, I had not have thought of that. That's an interesting question. Well, one, I'm not sure it's a question of reliance. I think it's more a question of opportunity. And of course, over that period of time, the United States became way bigger, way more powerful economically. But also, if I remember correctly, there were significant, there were barriers perhaps to trade. I'd have to go back and look, but there were certainly fewer trade barriers, like fewer tariff barriers between Canada and the UK and the empire, the other empire countries.
At that time, yeah.
So that might have also been a part of that. But look, we're not that big. We're obviously geographically very big, which does create certain challenges for us, but we're not very big, and we're sizable economically, but compared to the United States, we have no choice but to recognize that we are not their equal. We will not be their equal economically. We will not be their equal militarily. And so I think over the last, century and a half, 2 centuries, and certainly the last few decades, it's been more opportunity than anything else. There's no question now, given some of Trump's sloganeering and language, that the comfort we've had with that relationship has been put on edge. But I don't see the United States as being necessarily similar vis-a-vis Canada to what was our relationship as a member of the Commonwealth so many years ago.
But in terms of that size that you mentioned, how do we compensate for that? We're important trading partners, but when you look at the numbers, about 20% of our GDP relies on trade with the United States. Theirs is less than 2%. I think it's 1.6, 1.7. And we see that with the backtracking on the digital services tax, which, by the way, I think was the right thing to do. I think Prime Minister Carney played it horribly by saying, oh, no, we're moving forward with it. And then, less than 2 hours before midnight, when it's about to kick in, says, we'll get rid of it. But getting rid of it was the good idea. But on other issues, we're just going to face the fact that they have an awful lot of power. I'm not going to use Trump saying that they have all the cards, but they've got an awful lot of power over us and leverage.
They absolutely do. But just I can't resist. But on the digital services tax, we should, as Canada, we should have waited and kept with the much larger group of countries that were trying to work on this collaboratively. Our decision a couple of years back to go it alone, which a couple of other countries have as well, but for Canada to do that set us up for a problem. It has been an irritant with the Americans, not just Donald Trump, right from the time we said we're not going to wait for this other group of countries.
The OECD countries.
Exactly. So, my preference would have been not to have gone down that path in the first place and then having to rescind it and of course it's not rescinded, right? It's just, we're not charging it.
They've promised that they'll bring in legislation to rescind it. But
Yes.
You're right, it is still on the books. But, in terms of strategy, if they had announced the week before it was supposed to come into effect, look, we're going to put a pause on this. It still could have been a bargaining chip. And what I kept hearing from Liberal MPs and insiders was, well, we're using it as a bargaining chip to try and get something bigger. That's why we haven't gotten rid of it. But, we'll get rid of it, but not yet because we need it for bargaining. And then they gave it up with getting absolutely nothing but a resumption of talks in return.
Well, I'm not hearing that it was for nothing. And I don't know,
Yeah.
Brian. There's an awful lot going on behind the scenes that neither one of us is privy to. My understanding is that there is a lot more going on behind the scenes. That there may have been some bargaining. Who knows? There might have been some of this discussion at Kananaskis. But digital services tax. My views on supply management.
Oh, we'll get into that in a bit. That's on the list.
Can we please? Because my gosh. But I think there's a real, with all of this, there is a moment now for Canada to actually do the right things for Canada, not just for Donald Trump. We shouldn't be just playing around and it's not playing. We shouldn't be reacting and trying to figure out how we can best Donald Trump. We're not going to economically. The best way to deal with the fact that we have an elephant to the south of us is first understand that we have a relationship with an elephant, and that comes with some opportunities and it comes with some challenges, without question. Being pragmatic is probably the best strategy Canada could embark on. When you talk about that trade imbalance, though, there are a couple of nuances. A big amount of that trade that we have with the United States, or our exports to the United States, is of course oil, right? And they need that oil. The Gulf Coast refinery complex needs Canadian oil. It's all set up for Canadian heavy. So there's definitely some power, some influence there. It may, maybe not long term, but right now that is a bit of a bargaining. I wouldn't say it's a bargaining chip because we're not going to cut it off, but it's a recognition that there are certain strengths and weaknesses that are a little more nuanced than just the top level trade numbers. Okay. The other thing, though, but just to finish, the other thing is that trade balance that Canada has with some of the states, like 30 different states of the United States, actually do trade heavily with Canada. And so I've been saying this right from the beginning. Our best allies in dealing with Donald Trump's tariff nonsense are, in fact, Americans. They're the Americans in a number of those states, a number of the manufacturers that are now being hurt by some of the tariff impositions. If you're dependent on Canadian steel and aluminum, your prices just went up. And so you're going to be not happy about that. The biggest allies we have, the biggest strength we have right now is, frankly, with a whole lot of Americans, especially in those states and especially in those manufacturing sectors, who are hurting more from Donald Trump's tariffs than we are.
And I think that Ontario Premier Doug Ford has been very good on that, working those connections, going to the meetings with governors and pointing that out. it's going to require the Americans actually making that point in Washington to the audience of one, but it helps that the conversation is there. But you mentioned about oil, and we're not going to cut it off. So this is where I'm going to tap into your roots as an Easterner, now in Calgary. So I get the position of Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. This is a non-starter. I get it, politically, economically, so many reasons. But out east, you listen to an awful lot of the commentary. Why won't they just cut it off? They're not on Team Canada. They don't care about the country. The premier's a traitor. All of these things that you hear from folks that never leave Rosedale or Westmount and don't really have a sense of why that would be an unthinkable idea out here. So help those folks understand.
Well, a couple of things. The premier was forced into a bit of that corner because one of our federal ministers made the comment that we should cut off oil exports. That, or, put a tariff on, our own tariff on, whatever. Couple of points that are really important for everybody in this country to remember is that oil and gas exports are a massive part of the entire Canadian economy. So everything that we benefit from in terms of prosperity is significantly dependent on our oil and gas exports. So this is a Canadian enterprise. This is not just Alberta. Totally, in a number of ways. The oil industry here depends on all sorts of manufacturing inputs, service inputs from across the country. So this industry is a Canadian industry, and the taxes and the benefits and the economic prosperity all actually go to all of Canada and all of Canadians. That's something we do not talk about enough and has to be repeated. The other thing is that same minister didn't come out and say, and maybe we should put a hold on potash exports. That same minister didn't come out and say, we should put a hold on pick your manufacturing sector in Ontario, such as auto or, auto parts. So I recognize that sometimes things get said that are, emotional, but I will say that the Premier of Alberta really got pushed into a spot because of a federal minister picking on only oil exports from Alberta.
And it came especially under the previous government after a decade of saying, we don't want your resources, we don't want your pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. And then it became, we want to use it as a bargaining chip. Please let us cut off your lifeblood.
The nerve of absolutely that, Brian. 10 years of really having a thumb on the opportunities here, the prosperity here, the potential prosperity, again, not just for here, but for the whole country. But, and then turning around and saying, but we're going to use you to get to serve as a bargaining chip. It was deeply offensive to people here. And you started this by saying, I'm an Easterner. Well, I've been here for 12 years now, but I think of myself as a Canadian by far and away more than I think of myself as having been from Ontario or being an Albertan. I think of myself as a Canadian. And I have always been a free trader. I have always been, and for somebody as old as I am, always is actually a long time. But as long as I can remember, I've been a free trader. For as long as I can remember, I've been a big supporter of Canada embracing the fact that we are blessed with resources of all kinds. There are people around the world who literally would kill to have the opportunities and the resources that we are blessed with in this country. And we shoot ourselves in the foot over and over for whatever reasons. I mean, certainly on the climate piece, the irresponsibility of the most recent government, and the prior government didn't build a whole lot under that government either. So this is, I want to make that clear, but this last government, the absolute irresponsibility of a federal government suggesting and implementing policies that somehow suggested that Canada could solve the global climate challenge on its own was, irresponsible. It just very frustrating.
There were proposals put forward to help reduce global emissions by using Canadian oil and gas, letting LNG exports replace coal, and that was laughed at by the Trudeau administration. No, we can't do that. We just have to lower Canada's emissions, not worry about what's happening in India and China and South Korea and places that wanted our product.
The focus, and there's so much ideology there. And let me be clear about one thing. I hate it when people say that. I always try to be clear. It's like, let me be honest here. Well, I gonna try to be all the time. An awful lot of those people have been well-meaning. An awful lot of those people are not bad people, but they saw climate as the existential challenge for the world and felt that Canada had the most important thing for Canada was to meet our climate goals, our Paris commitments. Canada has never done that, has never met its goals. We have an unfortunate history of having aspirations, but never actually being able to come through. And knowing that what was happening in China and India and in other places all around the world, that somehow Canada could, on its own, by meeting our Paris commitments, have any kind of realistic impact on the global climate change challenge was completely nonsensical. And that's why I say I think, the politicians suggesting that we could do that and at the expense of Canadian economy, Canadian prosperity was irresponsible. It's well-intentioned, but we unfortunately have for 10 years been shooting ourselves in the foot so that a few people could pat themselves on the back. And what we're seeing now is a much greater recognition, ironically, from one of the most vocal and influential people in the climate change challenge world.
You're talking Mark Carney.
Mark Carney. I give him full marks for recognizing he's now Prime Minister of Canada. And as John Manley likes to say, and I think he's absolutely right, natural resources, this is our family business. Mm-hmm. And Mark Carney's now, he's kind of the head of the family. And so his first responsibility is to this country. And he's recognizing Canada's not going to solve climate change. We can play our part. We're still, I was part of the Pathways Alliance, the Oil Sands Pathways Alliance to reduce emissions. The industry has been reducing emissions per barrel dramatically over the last number of years anyway. Those are really good goals. But I give Mark Carney full credit so far because the words are right. As I said earlier, we need to see the actions. But I give him full credit for being able to say, my circumstances are this, the world's circumstances have changed, and we now need to get on with this. And so far, I'm impressed. I think these are the right things to do for the Prime Minister of Canada.
Well, and you're even hearing that he's saying the right things from people like Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe.
Yep.
And from Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. And I even ran into Premier Smith at an event here at Stampede, and she said, we'll see if the results turn out, but so far he's saying the right things, and that gives her hope. We'll take a quick pause here, but when we come back, let's get into supply management because I know you have some thoughts, and so do the listeners. Back in moments.
Welcome to Sephora. I'm looking for a perfume that's not too perfumey.
I got you. Serum moisturizer or moisturizer serum.
Let's get into layering.
My concealer is making me look worse.
Sounds like the wrong shade. Let's get you matched.
There's only one store that really gets what you're going for. Get beauty from people who get beauty. Only at Sephora.
Hi, Let's get you a basket.
Your local Benjamin Moore retailer is more than a paint expert. They're someone with paint in their soul. A sixth sense honed over decades. And if you have a question about paint, it's almost as if they can read your mind.
I sense you need a 2-inch angle brush for the trim in your family room. Regal selected an eggshell finish and directions to the post office.
Benjamin Moore paint is only sold at locally owned stores. Benjamin Moore. See the love.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other topics, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
So just before we entered into these new negotiations with the Americans to try and get a different trade deal, a new USMCA, a new CUSMA, whatever you want to call it, we decided to pass a bill put forward by the leader of the Separatist Party, Yves-François Blanchet, to say that Canadian diplomats and trade negotiators were forbidden by law from talking about supply management at all. Not dismantling it, but talking about it. Now, Martha, you've got a track record on supply management, but my discussions with the Americans, including Ambassador Pete Hoekstra, is they don't want to get rid of supply management, but they do want greater access for their producers, whether it's a bigger quota or something, and they just feel like we try and use supply management to block them at every turn. Can we negotiate away some quota, or should this system just be dismantled?
Wow. A lot of parts to that. I'll take a couple of bits, just one at a time. So first, we already have a deal with the United States. It is the USMCA, CUSMA, NAFTA, the new NAFTA. We have a treaty, a trade deal with the United States. It is the law of all three countries, because remember, it includes Mexico. So it is very dangerous to talk about negotiating a new deal or whatever, because in some way, like language matters. In some ways, that kind of language only feeds into Donald Trump's view that he can just throw it away, because he can't.
He clearly has been throwing it away since he brought in the tariffs on Liberation Day.
So that said, we have the realities of a president who seems to be getting away with executive actions without the consequences and without the enforcement of the legal constraints that he really should be facing. So there's a whole bigger question there, but that is the practical challenge that we're facing now. But I think it's worth repeating that we do have a deal.
Now, if we can just talk about that deal for a moment, though. The Americans have been complaining about how we handle dairy since basically the day after the deal was signed. And the Biden administration took us to trade panels twice. And you've forgotten more about supply management than I'll know. But my understanding, I was talking with Sylvain Charlebois about this a little while ago, and he said, well, the problem is the Americans negotiated quota access for their producers, but the holders of that quota are Canadian cheese producers like Saputo or Armstrong, and they just say, we're not buying any of your milk. And so that creates the irritant of, wait a minute, we thought we had a deal, and you're just still blocking us, which seems like a bad move when you look at the totality of our trade deal.
So there's so many parts to this. So I don't disagree with any of that, but the issue is much, much larger than some frustration that maybe the deal wasn't clear enough, or that the Canadian side has been not adhering to it completely well. I don't disagree with any of that, but the issue is much larger, and it's not just the Americans. The entire world is frustrated with Canada's supply management regime, because it basically enforces ridiculously high tariffs on any dairy, poultry, and egg imports into Canada. And so that's frustrating. I mean, we're not a tiny market. We're sizable, and producers around the world get frustrated when we go to negotiate trade deals like our trade deal with Europe or the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. The people are pretty frustrated with Canada because we say, sure, we'd love to have free trade, but oh, by the way, you can't sell us in effect, you can't sell us cheese, milk, eggs, yogurt, ice cream. So it's a much larger issue. Parsing out a couple of the things you said. One is this new bill that is about to achieve to get royal assent that was brought in this new government, as you said, by the Bloc Québécois.
And passed unanimously, though.
And passed unanimously in the House. The last government, just before the last government ended, there was a similar bill that had been put forward by the Bloc Québécois that achieved almost, I don't think it was completely unanimous, but almost unanimous consent in the House, Bill 282. It then went to the Senate. And the Senate, and I want to do a shout out to a couple of senators, Peter Harder and Peter Beam, who did yeoman's work in getting the Senate to do what the Senate is supposed to do. Sober second thought. The Senate hearings, the Senate committee worked on this. It had tons of investigation into the issue. Importantly, it was not actually to be a referendum on supply management. It was the concept of carving any sector, any part of our economy out of any future trade negotiations is something no country in the world has ever done. Let me just say, trade negotiation means negotiation. And this, as soon as you say, oh, but we'll negotiate everything except for that piece, it destroys the concept. And so many of us who appeared before the Senate on this said, this is not, if you did this on the auto sector, if you did this on steel and aluminum, we would say the same thing. You must not carve out a sector from trade negotiations, because then you've really tied one hand behind your back. So this is a nuance that's really important to understand. This new bill came in virtually the same. And I have to say the senators that I've spoken to did not do it again, because their view was, at a certain point, the Senate does have to respect what they see as the will of the people. If the House of Commons completely abrogated any responsibility for appropriate committee hearings on this bill, is the House of Commons' fault, and we as Canadians have to be critical of that. But I can understand, the Senate worked so hard to deal with 282 that the will was not there to do it on this bill. So this bill's going to pass.
You've got every party and every MP that's voting saying they're backing this. Why the stranglehold? I was talking to some farmers in Saskatchewan the other day, and they just blame Quebec. And it's Quebec farmers. And there's a bit of truth to that, I think.
Quebec and parts of Ontario and their pockets. I mean, look, there's a very strong dairy lobby in Alberta, too. There are a small number of very wealthy dairy farmers here. Now, the entire country, when supply management was brought in, there were about 145,000 dairy farmers across the country, and there were real issues in terms of price volatility, et cetera.
Now it's less than 10,000.
And now it's probably about 8,000. They are all multimillionaires. Even the small, 70-head farms in Quebec, they're all multimillionaires. The challenge here, and they are so because of the extraordinarily high prices that we charge, that we end up paying as consumers in Canada. It's the best way for me to describe it for listeners. It's the three legs of a stool, and this brings it back to the trade discussions. Supply management is a cartel. It's a legislated cartel. So, we say any other cartels are illegal because they're bad, but this one is sanctioned. Historically, might have been a reason for it. Does not stand the test of analysis anymore.
You can't really say that we're doing this to keep the small family dairy farm going when We've gone from over 100,000 to,
To
I think
fewer than
Charlevoix
10.
says 9, you say 8. It's
I think
under
it's 8
10.
now. It's definitely under 10 now. And that's exactly one of the arguments. Well, it protects the family farm. Absolute nonsense. In fact, the rate of consolidation in the last number of decades in dairy and poultry and eggs has been higher than virtually every other agricultural sector in Canada. So one could actually say it has hurt, right, the maintenance of the family farm. But if I can just the three legs of the stool, because people say to me, I don't understand supply management. The three legs of the stool are: you have price setting by the dairy commissions, they're federal, provincial, and they're made up of dairy farmers. No conflict of interest there. So you have them set prices. They set their prices based on, if you've ever worked in construction or had to, get construction work, it's like it's cost plus, right? So there's not a lot of incentive for figuring out how to be more efficient on the costs. So you have price fixing. The prices are fixed by the producers themselves. So as I said, clear conflict of interest. The second leg of the stool is that any industry, if you say it's all cost plus and you've got your fixed prices, you're going to get a lot of people wanting to get into that industry. It's like handing out McDonald's franchises for free. You're going to get an awful lot of people wanting to set up McDonald's. Well, that ultimately doesn't work. It's not tenable. So there's a quota system. So to keep the number of producers limited, you establish a quota. Basically, how much milk can that farmer produce, right? Well, the third leg of the stool is, and the quota ends up being really valuable, it's a little bit like a McDonald's franchise fee, right? If you want to run a McDonald's, you have to pay an awful lot of money for the privilege up front. You have to pay an awful lot of money for the privilege of having quota up front. So, in some parts of the country, quota is worth $45,000 a cow, and that doesn't include the value of the cow. In some places, it's fixed at $25,000 worth per cow. But you get the drift, right? There's a lot of money involved here. The third leg of the stool is that if you will have artificially higher prices in Canada because of the first two legs of the stool, which you do, you can't let cheaper, world market products come into the country because it will completely undermine the system, right? If you allowed American yogurt at a third of the price of what we pay for your yogurt here in Canada, well, guess what's going to happen? Everybody's going to buy American yogurt, right?
Well, can you speak to this claim that I hear on a regular basis? And that is that, again, even if we just allow a little bit more American product in, supply management protects us from those evil Americans with their chemical-filled products and their bovine growth hormones.
This just drives me crazy. This
But
holier
this is
than
what
thou
I get.
stuff.
And
I know.
what's amazing
But
is
it's not
that
true.
it goes across partisan lines. This is not one party or another.
No.
It goes across, and people think that supply management is there to protect us from inferior product. Talk to any baker about butter in Canada versus butter from other countries, and you will get a rant about how our product is not superior on that front.
But it's an awful lot more expensive.
Yes.
Ironically, Australia and New Zealand both had supply management in their dairy sectors many years ago. New Zealand's less of a good example. Australia was very similar to ours. And, you talked earlier about being right next door to an economic powerhouse. Australia is really close to China. And it was recognizing that its economy needed to become a lot more competitive. In the early 2000s, they implemented policies to actually ensure Australian, the whole economy, it wasn't just dairy, but the whole economy become much more competitive. As part of that, they actually got rid of supply management. The Australian dairy industry is now one of the most lucrative, powerful industries in Canada, in the world. New Zealand does really well too. You'll hear, Canadian farmers saying, "Well, the climate's different," and honestly, it drives me crazy because some of this is all just, I don't want to say nonsense because that's a little harsh, and I don't want to be flippant. These are not truths.
How can we get rid of it, though?
And so here's the thing. What the opportunity, and so just to complete the picture of the three stools, sorry, Brian, but what that means to prevent low-cost product from coming in, we have tariffs on milk, dairy products, poultry, eggs, for any other producing country in the world, including the United States, of up to almost 300%. That is to make sure that we don't get that cheaper product coming in, because you add the tariff on and then it becomes comparable in price. So, we basically have built a wall around Canada. The response from the rest of the world is, well, you can't sell us your dairy because, that's how the World Trade Organization rules work. You can't suck and blow. You can't keep yours protected and then come and sell in on ours. The other challenge is because we've made ours so expensive, there isn't a market internationally because that we can't compete, which is such a shame because we have in Nova Scotia, let me just pick on Nova Scotia, there is a really fantastic cheese, artisanal cheese manufacturing sector in Nova Scotia, for example. But that stuff is so expensive. It wins global awards. Some of those cheeses, and Quebec too, Ontario, other parts of the country, but they're limited to the Canadian market, which is a real shame.
There was a Lancaster cheddar from Lancaster in Ontario that won World's Top Cheddar a few years ago.
Yes. And the rest of the world doesn't know it because they can't.
And you can barely get it in Canada.
There you go. So let me go back to, if I can, to the opportunity. A couple of big dairy companies in Canada. One is a cooperative owned by, the irony here just kills me, owned by Quebec dairy farmers, Agripour, now produces more American milk than produces Canadian milk.
Because they bought into American dairy?
Because they knew that if they wanted to expand into other markets, which most successful businesses see as opportunities, they had to actually go outside of Canada and set up shop in Agripour's case in the United States. What really is frustrating about that is that the Quebec dairy farmers that own it, they keep their wealth in terms of the Canadian market with inflated prices. But for Agripour, the company, to go into the United States and process more American milk than Canadian milk, those are American jobs, not Canadian jobs. So we've in effect exported jobs into other markets. Saputo is a Quebec company, Quebec dairy company. It's one of the largest dairy companies in the world, has massive operations in Australia and elsewhere for the same reason. So, good on them. That's fantastic. But we make good milk here. We could be making a lot more milk here for those export markets, but we can't because of the rules, because of this very inward-looking, we need to protect our cozy little arrangement here at all costs. The key is we could do this. Australia got rid of supply management. As I said, that industry is now one of the world's best.
How would we do it? If we were going to do it, how would it happen? Because another argument I hear is, well, the banks have so much money tied up in loans for the quota that it would be too expensive, or if you just, didn't compensate for the loans for the quota, that you would effectively take a real hit for the banks.
No. So this is what Australia did. I mean, the first premise is you can't jeopardize the farmers and the producers who, based on having quota, borrowed money to build barns, borrowed money. You can't do that. That's unfair. So how do you compensate the existing quota holders in a way that allows them to not, be jeopardized financially, but in a way that also doesn't cost the Canadian taxpayer billions of dollars? Now, you hear the number floating around. If you just multiply the quota number by number of cows, $30 billion. It's not that much. I've done a lot of work on this. We had an MPP student from the School of Public Policy do some fantastic work. He graduated, I guess, 2 years ago now. some fantastic work with much more updated numbers. The number would probably be about $8 billion, in that range. Now, that's not chump change. That's a lot of money, especially at a time when Canada's making a whole lot of financial commitments on military and various other things. But what Australia did, and this was the genius of the Australian approach. And remember, this was not Australia just focusing on dairy. This was Australia recognizing it needed to be a lot more competitive. It had big economies around it growing, like China. Oh, does that not sound familiar? That maybe this is a moment in time for Canada to actually, in all of its sectors, become more competitive? But on dairy, what the Australians did is they used the system itself to build the fund that actually paid out the quota for the farmers. And so over the course of, it was either 20 or 25 years, they said, they determined what the number was that would have to make the farmers whole. They then said, okay, X, say 10 billion. It wasn't 10 billion, but for the sake of argument, if they said $10 billion was what they were going to need to make the farmers whole, basically paying out their quota and making sure that they could get more on their feet to be able to compete internationally. It's hard because on a podcast you can't see my hands, but if you say the supply managed price was $10, the world market price was $5, they increased the cost of a liter of milk by 11 cents from the $5, so $5 plus 11 cents. Those numbers are not real, but the 11 cents is. But I'm trying to do the graphics here. For that 11 cents per liter produced for 20 years was the source of the money to build the fund to buy the farmers out. So yes, did it cost so it wasn't across taxpayer base, it was consumers. But the consumers, if they didn't do the consumers were still going to be paying $10. If the consumers were paying $5+, that was still better than paying $10. And over 20 years, that actually managed to ensure that the farmers in Australia were made whole economically. Did everyone stay in the industry? Did everyone manage to sort of rally to this and compete? No. Some of the dairy farmers in Australia sold out to others. There was some consolidation. That's not a bad thing. Like I said, the Australian industry is now a powerhouse globally, which has benefited the Australian dairy sector. Like it's an opportunity for Canada. So for me, it's not we need to get rid of supply management because supply management is bad and it's made a very small number of people ultra wealthy at the cost of consumers, which is true. But it's also a shame because we are depriving our own dairy farmers and the dairy sector and the producers from using more Canadian production, building Canadian jobs to be able to participate in the global marketplace. But I will say fundamentally, the dairy lobby. So if you're spending $200 million a year, and just by if you add how much a billboard costs and a TV ad costs and how much the milk insignia on the Toronto Maple Leafs
on the Leafs jersey, yeah,
it's too bad. Probably would have been more costly if it had been the Oilers. But anyway, that's really expensive. I mean, when I first doing my work on this, the understanding was well over $100 million a year of marketing. Well, that's you and I are paying for that, right? Because of our inflated dairy, poultry, and egg prices. But the people who benefit from that, the lobbyists, the marketing people, the ad campaign people, they all have a vested interest in having the dairy farmers themselves believe that supply management is sacred. And they also have a vested interest in making sure, because the dairy farmers will spout these lines, even if they're not true, but they've been told them. There are some dairy farmers, by the way, who behind the scenes are actively working to get rid of supply management for these very reasons, because they understand what they're missing. But they have to be extremely quiet about this because it's a tough. There are people who are very, very strongly intent on keeping this system because they benefit so much from it. But then that's by far the most active lobby on Parliament Hill. So even though behind the scenes, many of those politicians who voted for that bill agree that supply management needs to go, they vote for it because they say they don't have the votes. And the industry, the lobby, has a vested interest in making sure that those politicians continue to believe that there are simply too many votes in support of supply management. So we need the Canadian public to understand the realities of this much, much more. If I can, right now, every other sector in this country, automotive, whether, the big three, auto parts, canola, beef, aluminum, steel, all of the aluminum and steel industry in Canada is now under tariffs, and they are suffering. Part of the reason is that we have this extraordinary need somehow to protect supply management, but the cost, what do we give up? What does every other sector give up? If we were able to say, the Americans, I think you're absolutely right. They're not saying get rid of supply management. They just want some greater access to the country's market. But we need to get rid of supply management for Canada's sake, not for Donald Trump. But right now, because we are holding on to it so dearly, the negotiation on every other economic sector is harmed.
Well, I'm sure you've heard from the same people I have who have been part of the past negotiations in the last Trump administration and are being consulted now from various industries. They will tell you straight up, maybe not on the record, but they will tell you straight up that the dairy lobby could scupper the entire deal and hurt every other industry.
Well, this recent bill is hugely problematic. Even as I said before, even if it weren't dairy, excluding any economic sector from trade negotiations is a problem. But our keeping supply management as a system, absolutely. I mean, I'm in Western Canada. The beef farmers, the canola people, everybody. The corn people in Ontario, corn farmers who have expanded into the United States simply because they can't afford the acreage in Ontario because of the inflated costs of that acreage, because of the artificial wealth of the dairy industry. I mean,
I'll say something that's not popular, though. Isn't Canada overall a protectionist country? While we scream about the Americans and tariffs and different things, beyond supply management, we protect our banks, we protect our telcos, our media companies, and it's a long list of thou shalt not trade in this.
Well, foreign ownership restrictions are a bit different. I mean, there's nothing to prevent Verizon from coming in and setting up shop in Canada. We don't prevent. There are lots of banks that come into Canada and operate. What we do restrict is ownership in those companies, and that's a much different conversation. Nothing compares to this extraordinary artificial sanctioned cartel that continues with supply management. My hope, Brian, is that what's happening with Donald Trump and the Americans, and let's face it, there are a lot of people behind Trump who also, I mean, supply management was a frustration for Obama, was a frustration for Biden, it was a frustration for, it's been a frustration for decades. The challenge here is we need the other economic sectors in this country to be very firm with our politicians to say enough is enough. We know that there's actually real benefits to getting rid of supply management for Canada, for Canadian consumers, and ironically for the Canadian dairy, poultry, and egg sectors in terms of potential global opportunities. But we're ignoring those and hurting all of our sectors in all of these trade negotiations. So, where are they? We need them to step up. We need the canola farmers. We need the beef farmers. We need aluminum steel. We need the auto parts sector people to be making these noises with our Canadian politicians, because if they don't speak up, the Canadian politicians will continue to be under this frustrating belief that somehow those dairy votes are more important than every other economic sector in this country.
Martha Hall Findlay, thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Full Comment is a Postmedia podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Remember to hit subscribe, like, leave a comment or review wherever you're getting your podcast, whether it's on Amazon, Apple, Spotify, what have you. Help us out. Leave us that review. And spread the word. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I Promised You.
So, although abortion was sort of accessible, it really wasn't.
But then 1988 rolls around. And what's the law on abortion then? Suddenly, there wasn't one. Literally no restrictions existed in 1988. Abortion went from heavily restricted to completely unrestricted almost overnight. There was no referendum on this. There wasn't even an act of parliament. This whole thing is due to a somewhat surprise decision out of the Supreme Court of Canada. And it came about in large part because of one man, a Canadian doctor who had been relentless about running illegal abortion clinics since the 1960s and was determined to overturn the laws prohibiting the practice. Along the way, he endured multiple arrests, constant raids, a jail term, a firebombing of his clinic, an attack by a fanatic wielding garden shears, the approbation of virtually his entire profession, and frequent death threats. If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.